good evening, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be reading this book about Mesopotamia, Iraq in ancient times. So let's just dive right in and get into the story here. Mesopotamia, Alright, so we're going to read the first cities, irrigation and farming, writing, craft workers, trade, at home, temple, kings, the great death pit, warfare, the king's laws, and empire. So starting off with the first cities. Mesopotamia is a Greek word meaning the land between the rivers. These rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, which wind their way south from the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey and across the flat plains of present-day Iraq until they pour into the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamia is part of the Fertile Crescent, a curve of land stretching from the Persian Gulf north and west to the Mediterranean Sea. It was here more than 10,000 years ago that people, for the first time ever, learned to produce their food by farming. Instead of moving from place to place, hunting animals and gathering wild plant foods, they settled down, growing crops and keeping sheep and cattle. In one part of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, villages grew into towns and then cities, the first in the world. It was in these cities that writing, kingship, temples, irrigation, bronze making, written laws, and many other features of later civilizations were invented. Here's a little map here of Mesopotamia. Here's Assyria, Akkad, Sumer. All the little cities around. Let's see what else. Over time, many different peoples speaking different languages lived in the Mesopotamian area. The civilization was created around 4000 BCE by people who lived in a region called Sumer in southern Mesopotamia. These people were the Sumerians, who built the first cities such as Ur and Uruk. Around 2350 BCE, Sumer was conquered by Sargon, king of Akkad, the region to the north, who created the world's first empire. Akkadian, a language related to Arabic and Hebrew, replaced Sumerian as the main language. Yet, despite changes of language, the arrival of new peoples, and the rise and fall of more empires, the main features of Mesopotamian civilization, such as the writing system, continued for thousands of years. There's some remains here of Uruk, what they look like today. Amazing. Irrigation and farming. Like Egypt, where another early civilization developed, the region of Mesopotamia, where Iraq is today, is a hot climate with little rain. In both ancient civilizations, it was only possible to grow food thanks to the annual flooding of rivers, the Nile in Egypt, and the Tigris and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Unlike the Nile, which flooded at the right time of year to plant crops, Mesopotamia's rivers flooded when the crops were already growing in the fields. The water had to be channeled and stored so that later it could be used to water the fields. In early times, people lived and farmed close to the rivers. To prevent floods from washing away their villages, they built dikes, raised mounds on the riverbanks. They dug canals and ditches to carry the water away from the river to reservoirs. Canals also carried water to areas which had previously been desert, allowing more and more food to be produced. The rivers also carried silt, which was left behind after the flood season ended. To prevent the canals filling up, the silt had to be dug out regularly. This was hard work, but everyone knew that it had to be done to stop the land returning to desert. There's a drawing down here of what building a canal would look like. Very stressful, arduous work. The most important food crops were barley and dates. Date palm trees are either male or female. Male flowers produce pollen, which female flowers use to make fruit. One male tree produces enough pollen for 50 female trees. To have plenty of dates, Mesopotamian farmers grew more female trees, cutting down most male trees for wood. Usually pollen is carried from tree to tree by insects, such as bees. With so few male trees, farmers did this job themselves. Which looks like they're picking some dates right there. Writing. The Sumerians needed to keep records of cattle, sheep, and crops. Around 3300 BCE, they began to do this by drawing simple pictures on clay tablets. A picture of a bull's head was used to show cattle, while an ear of barley stood for grain. Pictures could also be used to show ideas. A drawing of a foot, for example, could stand for a journey. Over time, the style of drawing changed, with curved lines becoming groups of straight wedges, the quickest marks to make with a cut reed called a stylus. From these marks, Mesopotamian writing was called cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped. By 3100 BCE, people had realized that a sign could be used to show the sound of the word as well as the object itself. So the sign for a bull could be the sound gu, or bull in Sumerian, while the sign for a fish could be ku, which is fish in Sumerian. By grouping sound signs together, people could now spell different words. In doing this, they had invented writing. Check it out. Cuneiform was a difficult writing system to learn. While our alphabet has just 26 letters, there were more than 600 cuneiform signs. Some boys were sent to school at a young age to train to be professional writers called scribes, but only wealthy people could afford to have their sons trained. We know about school lessons thanks to thousands of exercise tablets that have been found. These have a text written by a teacher on one side, with a pupil's copy less skillfully done on the other. Some of these exercises describe schoolboys' lives. When I arose early in the morning, I faced my mother and said to her, "Give me my lunch. I want to go to school." My mother gave me 2 rolls and I set out. Awesome. Some things never change, right? Although cuneiform was invented for record keeping, many more uses were found for it. It was used to write down laws, histories, stories, hymns, letters, scientific texts, magic spells, and recipes. It continued to be used for almost 3,200 years by many different peoples across Western Asia. Next is craft workers. Pouring some copper there, looks like. Anyway. The Mesopotamians were experts at making tools, weapons, and sculptures out of metal. At first, the main metal they used was copper. Then sometime before 3000 BCE, they discovered that adding a small amount of tin to the copper made a new, harder metal called bronze. Bronze was much better for making tools and weapons. It also melted at a lower temperature than copper, was more fluid, and was easier to cast. To make flat tools such as knives, the craft workers carved their shape on a flat stone. Then they heated lumps of copper and tin together in a stone or pottery vessel called a crucible until they melted. The liquid bronze was then poured into the stone mold. To make statues and bowls, the Mesopotamians invented a method called the lost wax process. First, they made a model out of wax, or of clay covered with wax. Clay was packed around the model to make a mold. This was heated so that the wax melted and drained out through the holes. Liquid metal was poured into the mold, filling the space left by the lost wax. Once the metal had cooled and hardened, the clay mold was broken open to reveal the sculpture. Mesopotamians were also fine potters. Sometime before 4500 BCE, they invented the potter's wheel, which allowed them to shape a bowl while turning it. The earliest pots were made on a slow wheel. Around 2000 BCE, they invented a fast-turning wheel, which allowed them to make vessels with thinner walls in a quicker time. Like these guys, I guess. trade. That's a cool map up here showing all the things that were traded. Ooh, anyway, I could look at that all day. I love maps like that. Mesopotamia had plenty of clay, bitumen, which is a natural tar, reeds, and palm trees, whose wood is only good for making rough beams. The country lacked all other raw materials such as stone, metal, and good timber for building or making furniture. So from the beginnings of Mesopotamian civilization, people had to trade with other lands to get the materials they needed. The easiest way to transport heavy goods, such as stones, was by water, along rivers and canals and across the sea. Boats were made of bundles of reeds, waterproofed by coating them with bitumen. Reed boats are still used in Iraq today, and remains of ancient boats show that they have been built in the same way for at least 7,500 years. It was much easier to row a boat downstream, carried along by the current, than upstream. For journeys upriver, donkeys were often used to pull the boats. They could also carry goods across land where no water route existed. I mean, I know they were shallow rivers, but shallow enough that donkeys could just tow the boats. I didn't know that. Large amounts of tin and copper were imported to make bronze. Bronze items such as tools and weapons were then sold abroad. Other goods sold abroad included textiles, pottery, barley, and dates. Grindstones, which every family needed for grinding barley into flour, were imported in vast quantities from the north. At a place now called Yarim Tepe, archaeologists found a building dating from 4500 BCE, in which a single room held several hundred grindstones. This must have been a merchant's warehouse. There was long-distance trade with another ancient civilization, the Indus people of northern India, who sold precious stones such as carnelian. Indian carnelian was used in Mesopotamian jewelry and works of art. Check out the boat. It's an actual artifact and a little rendering there. At home, hard at work here. Like houses in southern Iraq today, Mesopotamian homes had thick walls of bricks made of mud and chopped straw dried in the sun. This was the perfect building material to protect the family from the scorching summer heat. Roofs were usually flat, made of palm tree planks with a layer of reed and palm leaf matting covered with mud. So remains of one. For security and privacy, Mesopotamian houses rarely had outside windows. Instead, there was often a courtyard, giving light and air to the rooms of the house. Another reason for this arrangement is given by a tablet, which says, "Rooms opening out of each other are unlucky, but those opening onto a court bring good luck." The richest people had a central courtyard, with rooms arranged on all four sides, while poorer people might have rooms on just 2 or 3 sides, or no courtyard at all. Many of the houses had lavatories, which had paved floors with a hole leading through a pottery drain to a sewer. A variety of household items have been found, which help us build up a picture of daily life. These include pottery jars for storing beer and date wine, copper cooking pots and bowls, plates and cups made from pottery, stone, or copper. Meals were cooked over a fire in the courtyard or in a kitchen. There were also dome-shaped brick ovens for baking bread. Tablets from Babylon contain recipes, such as this one for cooking wild hens. Assemble the following ingredients in a pot of water: a piece of fat, a carefully measured amount of vinegar, pieces of aromatic wood soaked in beer, and rue leaves. When it comes to a boil, add samidu, a spicy plant, leek and garlic mashed with onion. Put the birds in this broth and cook. Yum, a boiled chicken. Yummy. Temples. Ziggurats. Every Mesopotamian city was believed to belong to a main god or goddess, who was worshipped in a great temple in the center of the city. The temple was the home of the god, whose statue they kept there. As well as being the owner of the city, people believed that each god watched over an aspect of life or nature. Nana, worshipped in Ur, was the moon god. There were also many lesser gods, who oversaw every possible activity from brickmaking to brewing beer. The people of the city visited the temple to ask their gods favors or to thank them for granting them. They brought with them gifts such as animals to be sacrificed or killed as offerings to the god. At merchants returning from long river journeys would present Nana with a little silver boat to thank him for protecting them on their journey. There was a large staff of priests, priestesses, and servants who looked after the god's needs. Twice a day, in the morning and evening, the god was given a meal, which was spread on a table before the statue. On special occasions, the statue was taken out of the temple and carried in a procession through the streets. It was sometimes taken to other cities so that the god could meet other gods. In wartime, the statues accompanied armies into battle. This gave the soldiers the sense that their god was fighting alongside them. There are different ideas about why ziggurats came to be built. Building a tall tower was a way for people on Earth to reach up to the heavens, to be closer to the gods who were thought to live there. A ziggurat might also have been meant to represent a sacred mountain, or to be a ladder for the god to climb up to heaven at night. In the flat Mesopotamian landscape, ziggurats could be seen for miles around, showing the importance of the gods who lived in them and the wealth and power of the city which had built them. Kings. While each Sumerian city was thought to belong to a god, it was ruled on the god's behalf by a king. According to Sumerian beliefs, the idea of kingship had come down to earth from heaven at the beginning of time. The king was a chief priest, whose main role was to serve the gods. He built and repaired the city's temples, and played a leading role in religious ceremonies meant to ensure good harvests. He was also a judge, overseeing law and order, and a war leader who led his city's armies into battle. These roles of judge and warrior were also religious. Like kingship, the laws were believed to have come from the gods, and wars were seen as quarrels between rival city gods. There is a number of different royal titles. A king of a single city was called the Ensi, which is thought to mean lord. Through warfare, some kings were able to extend their rule over a number of cities. Their title was Lugal, which means big man. The beautiful box above this was discovered in the 1920s by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in a royal grave at Ur. Unsure of its purpose, Woolley called it the Standard of Ur. The box has two sides, showing the activities of a king in peace and in war. The peace side depicts a royal feast in the top row. At the top right, you can see a musician playing a lyre and a woman singing. The king on the left wears no special royal regalia, such as a crown. However, he can be recognized because he's much bigger than the other figures. Right there. Regal regalia. The Great Death Pit. In 1928 to 1929, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley made an amazing discovery while digging in the ancient city of Ur. He found a deep rectangular pit dating from about 2700 to 2400 BCE, in which 68 women lay buried. By the entrance to the pit, approached by a ramp, 6 men's bodies lay in a line, as if on guard. This mass grave also contained 4 lyres and 2 beautiful statuettes of male goats. Woolley called his discovery the Great Death Pit. Like a detective, he tried to solve the mystery of the burial. How had they died? And why had they been buried with such beautiful treasures? Check it out. Goodness. Woolley had already uncovered many Mesopotamian graves and was used to finding goods buried with the dead. In most cases, bodies were wrapped in a reed mat and placed in the earth with pots, beads, and tools. This was evidence that people believed in a life after death, a next world where they could take their belongings with them. From writings, we know that they called this world the Land of No Return. The death pit was one of 16 graves in Ur in which groups of people had been buried with rich treasures, including the standard of Ur, which we saw on the last page. Woolley believed that these were royal graves and that the people were attendants or courtiers who had been chosen to accompany the king or queen to the next world. Because there was no obvious signs of violence, Woolley suggested that the men and women had entered it of their own free will. They had then drunk poison or a sleeping drug from the bowls which lay beside them before the earth was piled on top. What a great mystery. Warfare. In Sumer, there was a dozen separate city-states, which often quarreled with each other over farmland or the water supply. These quarrels often led to warfare. Each of the cities was surrounded by a strong brick wall needed for protection from other cities and also foreign invaders. The first recorded war took place in about 2500 BCE between the cities of Lagash and Umma. Eannatum, king of Lagash, won the war and then had a stele or upright stone set up, celebrating his victory. It shows his army on the march, while his dead enemies are being eaten by vultures. Another victorious Sumerian army from about the same time is shown below on the standard of Ur. Ta-da. In an inscription of about 2050 BCE, Shulgi, king of Ur, boasted of his skill at winning battles which he claimed to fight on behalf of his god Enlil. When I set off for battle to a place that Enlil has commanded me, I go ahead of my troops. I have a passion for weapons. Not only do I carry my spear and lance, I also know how to handle a sling. The clay pellets that I shoot fly around like a violent rainstorm. In my rage, I do not let them miss. Wow. So strong. We can also read Laments, poems of sorrow, which show us the viewpoint of the defeated. This lament was written after Ur was destroyed by the Elamites in 2000 BCE. Ur is destroyed, bitter in its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze in a mold. Our temple is destroyed. The gods have abandoned us. The king's laws. You messed up, my goodness. One of the most important duties of a Mesopotamian king was to oversee justice. Kings had to give decisions on quarrels over land and property, and they tried and punished criminals. They also wrote the first laws, in which they listed punishments for various crimes and described how cases should be judged. The most complete early law list is that of King Hammurabi, ruler of Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE. He had his laws carved on a 7.5-foot high cone-shaped stele. Hammurabi's stele has 49 columns in which 282 laws are listed. Among them, a son who struck his father would have both his hands chopped off. A man who put out the eye of another man would have his own eye put out. Most of these laws were not invented by Hammurabi, but were based on existing customs. The stele describes a river ordeal, shown in the picture over here, used when it was not clear if someone accused of a serious crime was guilty or innocent. This ordeal is also described in the oldest known law code, written 300 years before Hammurabi's time by a king of Ur. At the end of the list, Hammurabi explained that he had set the stele up as an example to later rulers. To the end of days, forever, may the king who happens to be in the land observe the words of justice which I have inscribed on my stele. Let that stele reveal to him the accustomed way, the way to follow, the land's judgments which I have judged. Empire. The most warlike Mesopotamian people were the Assyrians, who lived in the northern cities of Ashur, Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad. Between 950 and 612 BCE, the Assyrians conquered an empire which stretched across the Middle East, from western Persia, which is now Iran, to northern Egypt. The wealth of the Assyrian Empire allowed kings to build some of the biggest palaces found in Mesopotamia. Palace walls were covered in painted stone reliefs showing kings worshipping gods, hunting lions, and leading the Assyrian army into battle. The aim was to impress any visitor to the palace with the power of the Assyrian king. Check him out. I guess that's supposed to be Sargon. Oh dear. A little more happening there. By the first millennium BCE, many new ways of fighting had been invented. Bronze weapons had been replaced by iron ones, which were harder and sharper edged. The Assyrians also used horses, which they rode and used to pull fast two-wheeled chariots. They were expert at capturing walled cities, using great battering rams and siege towers. They were also extremely cruel. Wall carvings in Assyrian palaces show defeated enemies being skinned alive, while palace inscriptions left by kings boast of their cruelty. I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I skinned all the chief men, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar, so I impaled upon a pillar of stakes. Overkill, literally. Eventually, the cruelty of the Assyrians led to widespread rebellions. The king of Babylon joined forces with the Medes, who lived to the east of Mesopotamia, and destroyed the empire. In 614 to 612 BCE, the Assyrian cities were burned to the ground. And that's the end of our book tonight. Yeah, we won't go over all the little details about history. I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good